This is lecture one, part two. We just got through talking about a definition of social welfare policy, and we're shifting gears and we're talking about this idea of social justice. Once again, just as a reminder, if you'll go ahead and print out the PowerPoint slides and follow along as I narrate these slides, I think that's the best way for you to approach accessing the lectures. I'm on the slide number 10 that says, what is social justice? I'm looking at a textbook by Amanda Baruch. She's a social work professor in New Zealand. She's defining social justice in four different ways. I give you three of those four different ways, but essentially just keep in mind that what we're talking about here is not so much social justice on an individual level, but social justice on a more macro level. So allocative justice. So what's a fair or equitable distribution of resources in a society is what she's concerned with here when she's defining social justice. It's not about the type of social justice that adheres when you're interacting with individuals. That's a more micro approach. We're talking about a more macro view of social justice. And so she lays out an oligarchist perspective, she lays out a libertarian perspective, and then she also lays out a liberal perspective. And so we'll look at those different approaches to defining social justice. So first is an oligarchist approach. I'm on the slide titled Oligarchy and Social Justice. To an oligarchist, social justice is that which God has determined, right? So God has determined your place in life, the sort of differences between a higher class, lower class, and so forth. That's all been determined by God. It's been divinely ordained. And so to an oligarchist, our responsibility is simply to accept that place in life, and it's sort of a passive view of social justice. We accept our place for what God has determined. This is somewhat outmoded thinking, obviously, but there are some more modern notions that come from this sort of branch of thinking. And so modern day oligarchists will argue not so much about divine ordination, that God determines our place in life, or God determines a just distribution of resources, but more in terms of genetic predisposition. It's our genes that determines a fair or equitable allocation of resources. One scholar who argues in this line is Charles Murray. In his book, The Bell Curve, he lays out this sort of argument that it's a genetic predisposition that determines our standing in life. And so if you're curious about the arguments that he makes there, you can check out his book, The Bell Curve. A very famous social policy scholar at Harvard, by the way, a conservative scholar, naturally. The next view of social justice comes from the Libertarian Camp. And so as the term would suggest, libertarian, I'm thinking about the term libertarian. So liberty is emphasized over equality, as the term would suggest. So according to a libertarian, your place or your standing or the just distribution of resources in a society is based on how much you produce. So the more you produce, the more resources you're entitled to in terms of a fair allocation. The less productive you've been, the less resources you're entitled to. It's sort of a product. It's distribution according to product. So for someone like Donald Trump, who's produced arguably a lot, right, in our society, he's contributed a lot to our GDP, our domestic product. So he's entitled to the resources that he's enjoyed in life. Right, so that's a sort of view. Generally speaking, libertarians will oppose government interference in daily affairs. So, for example, affirmative action. So government efforts to remedy past injustices on a racial level. So libertarians will typically oppose this line of thinking. Affirmative action we just mentioned, but taxation. So libertarians generally oppose taxation. It's all in degrees, of course. I'm sort of speaking in extremes, but generally speaking, that's another form of government intervention, taxation. And so libertarians would oppose this to some degree. Robert Nozick, who is a famous libertarian scholar, says that we don't look so much to product per se, but whatever inequality that results is in fact fair, so long as the process by which that inequality came about was in fact fair. So he has a more process-oriented view of social justice. What he's saying is as long as the process by which that distribution came about is fair, then that result is the resulting distribution is also fair. So that's a libertarian view of social justice. in terms of the liberal view of social justice, I'm looking here at two different camps. There's the John Rawls perspective, and there's also a utilitarian perspective, mostly from John Stuart Mill. And we'll look at that in a little more detail. So for liberal, typically there's an effort to balance both liberty and equality, a little more effort to balance those two. It's not so much about equality, it's certainly not so much about liberty, but there's an attempt to balance those two. In terms of John Rawls and his view of social justice, you can check out his book, A Theory of Justice, to get more information about some of his arguments. But essentially, I'm being very simplistic here, but essentially he says this. He says, put yourself behind a veil of ignorance. Imagine yourself, in other words, in sort of a hypothetical world in which you don't know your standing in life. You don't know if you're better than the person next to you in terms of resources, in terms of not just resources, but in other facets as well. But imagine yourself in this hypothetical world. And if you were in this world, what sort of distribution of resources would be most fair in that type of world? So if you were living in that hypothetical world, you would want some sort of safety net, is what he's arguing, because you could be among the worst off in that society. And so typically, Rawlsian liberals will promote some sort of social minimum. That's the operative word there, social minimum. And so it begs the question of where do we set that social minimum? So for a Rawlsian liberal, you'd want to set that social minimum as high as possible. But the trick is you don't want to sacrifice any sort of productivity or efficiency. So in short, as a Rawlsian liberal, you want to set a social minimum, but not so high that it would affect any sort of economic efficiency. The next view of social justice comes from John Stuart Mill. This is a utilitarian approach. And if you want to check out his arguments, you can read the book on the connection between justice and utility. That's John Stuart Mill's book on social justice. But he says this, I'm just picking out some of the primary points, but he says we all have sort of an intuitive sense of justice. We would recognize justice or injustice, in fact, if we saw it. So if we saw some big guy just pounding on a little guy, we would recognize that as being unjust. A just distribution, according to the Millsian approach, is basically that distribution which is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So if we have a distribution that favors the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that's in fact a just distribution according to John Stuart Mill. So that, of course, gets into the question of how do you value each person's happiness or utility or preferences, in other words, right? So according to John Stuart Mill, everyone's utility or happiness is valued equally. And so that's a very quick primer on social justice. This week's discussion board is about where you stand. And I'm asking you to think about the libertarian approach and the liberal approach. And I'm thinking more along the lines of the Rawlsian approach. Where do you stand? Do you see yourself more towards the libertarian approach or towards more of a liberal approach to social justice in terms of distribution of resources in our society? Are you one that favors liberty more, or are you one that are you more towards an equal distribution of resources in our society? So we'll tackle that question. At this point, you should access the discussion board to answer that question.